They told us humans were fragile. It was the first thing inscribed into our diplomatic briefings, repeated with the quiet certainty of settled science. Soft tissue, limited sensory range, dependent on narrow atmospheric tolerances, a species that required assistance to stand among the stars. Harmless, predictable, forgettable. So when the Terran envoy entered the chamber, we did not watch him. We watched the war. The council chamber of Kethra Prime was not built for peace. It was built to contain the absence of it. The architecture itself carried the memory of extinction. Blackened alloy walls shimmered faintly with heat scars from conflicts long resolved, or perhaps merely paused. The air composition shifted subtly from one delegation zone to another, tailored for beings whose biology would otherwise kill them within moments. Gravity fluctuated in layered fields across the floor, each step a negotiation with physics itself. And at the center of it all stood the Zir warlord. Even now, cycles later, I struggle to describe what it felt like to exist in his presence. The Zir were not merely conquerors, they were inevitabilities. Their empire did not expand, it consumed. Entire star systems vanished into their dominion, rewritten as if they had always belonged. The war had lasted 13 standard cycles. 13 cycles of burning atmospheres, of orbital bombardments that cracked continents like brittle shells, of distress signals that simply stopped. Billions lost, perhaps more. And now, at last, it was ending. Not with victory, with surrender. The coalition delegates surrounded the central dais, each species occupying their designated environmental field. Some stood rigid, their exoskeletons locked in defensive posture. Others pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that betrayed chemical fear. A few, like my own kind, remained outwardly still, though our internal systems raced beyond control. We were not here to negotiate. We were here to witness the terms of our survival, or our extinction. The Terran envoy stood among us, unremarkable in every possible way. Their ambassador, a tall, narrow figure wrapped in adaptive fabric, held a posture of practiced diplomacy, calm, neutral, controlled. And behind him, the translator. I remember how little I thought of him. He stood half a step back, as protocol dictated. No armor, no visible augmentation, no insignia of rank or authority. His form was small by most galactic standards, his skin exposed, his breathing visible, vulnerable. His purpose was singular, to translate the Zir warlord's declaration into the hundreds of linguistic frameworks present in the chamber. A tool, nothing more. The warlord began to speak. His voice did not travel through air alone. It vibrated through the chamber's structure, resonating in frequencies designed to bypass translation delays. The meaning was immediate, invasive, impossible to ignore. The coalition has failed. The words struck like impact weapons. You have resisted. You have endured. You have disappointed. A ripple of unease moved through the delegates. Even now the warlord spoke as if this were a performance, a ritual he had enacted countless times before. Your surrender is accepted under the following conditions. And then he began listing them. Worlds to be relinquished, populations to be culled, technologies to be surrendered, histories to be erased. Each demand more absolute than the last, each one a step closer to oblivion.
I turned my attention at last to the Terran translator. This was his moment. This was the function his species had been invited to fulfill, to act as the bridge between annihilation and comprehension. He should have begun immediately. He did not. At first, I assumed it was delay, perhaps a limitation of his biology or his translation systems. But as the warlord continued, the human remained silent, still, listening. His head was slightly inclined, as if absorbing every word with precise intent. His eyes, small, forward-facing, moved in subtle patterns, tracking not just the speaker, but the entire chamber. Observing, calculating, memorizing. There was no fear in his posture, no visible stress response, only focus. The warlord's demands grew harsher, more final. Entire species classifications were designated for genetic discontinuation. Cultural archives would be seized and repurposed. Even planetary atmospheres would be altered to better suit Zir biology. This was not surrender. This was erasure. Still, the human did not speak. A murmur began to spread among the delegates, confusion layered over dread. Some attempted to access their own translation systems, but interference from the Zir signal rendered them unreliable. We needed the human, and he was waiting. Why? The warlord paused briefly, as if to allow the weight of his terms to settle. It was in that silence that something changed. The human shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to draw immediate attention from those still paralyzed by fear, but I saw it. He straightened. Only slightly. His shoulders aligned, his stance adjusted, not into aggression, but into readiness, as if he had reached a decision. The warlord resumed, his tone sharpening with finality. These terms are non-negotiable. Compliance will be immediate. Resistance will be... He stopped. Not because he chose to, because the human moved. It was a small motion, a step forward, barely crossing the invisible boundary of his assigned position. But in a chamber where every movement carried meaning, it was enough. Enough to break protocol. Enough to draw attention. The warlord's gaze shifted, focusing on the translator for the first time. A pause. A calculation. And then I realized something that sent a cold fracture through my core systems. The human had not failed to translate. He had chosen not to. And now, as every eye in the chamber turned towards him, as the warlord's presence bore down with quiet, lethal curiosity, the human opened his mouth to speak, not as a tool, not as a bridge, but as something else entirely. And in that moment, before a single word was uttered, history began to fracture.
The human spoke, and the galaxy stopped. Is that your final offer? The words were simple, structurally insignificant. They carried no embedded threat, no diplomatic nuance, no coded defiance. And yet, they struck the chamber with more force than any weapon the Zir had deployed in 13 cycles of war. Silence followed. Not the tense, fearful quiet we had endured moments before, but something deeper, something unnatural. Even the environmental system seemed to hesitate, as if the station itself could not process what had just occurred. I felt it ripple through every delegation. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Because translators do not speak for themselves. They do not question. They do not exist within the negotiation. They are conduits, nothing more. The Zir warlord did not respond immediately. His form remained perfectly still at the center of the dais, a towering silhouette of chitinous armor and coiled strength. But something subtle shifted in his posture. Attention, focused, narrowed, dangerous. "Clarify," the warlord said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of theatrical projection. The human did not retreat. He did not glance toward his ambassador for correction. He did not attempt to recover the illusion of compliance. Instead, he took another step forward. The movement was deliberate, measured, irreversible. "I asked," the human repeated, his voice carrying, not through dominance, but through precision, "if those are your final terms." A tremor passed through the chamber, not physical, conceptual. We were witnessing a boundary being crossed, one so fundamental that most of us had never even considered its existence. The Zir warlord's upper limbs flexed, the layered plating along his exoskeleton shifting with a sound like distant thunder. To many species, it would have registered as nothing. To those who had studied the Zir, it was a warning. "You are not authorized to speak," the warlord said. Each word landed with controlled restraint, the kind that precedes catastrophic violence. "You will translate, nothing more." The human tilted his head, an almost imperceptible motion, not submissive, not defiant, evaluative. "I understand your instruction," he said, and then he did not obey it. A surge of agitation spread among the coalition delegates. Some attempted to signal the Terran ambassador. Others initiated emergency protocols that, under normal circumstances, would remove a compromised participant from the chamber. None of it activated. The systems remained unresponsive, locked, or overridden. I did not yet understand what that meant. I only knew that the human stood alone in defiance of a power that had erased civilizations without hesitation. The Zir warlord shifted his full attention onto him now, a predator acknowledging an anomaly. "You misunderstand your position," the warlord continued. "Your species was permitted to observe, to assist. You were not granted agency." The word echoed. Agency. It was the foundation of every galactic hierarchy. To possess it was to matter. To lack it was to be irrelevant. The human's response came without delay. "No, I understand it perfectly," he said. And then, before anyone could interrupt, he spoke again, not to the warlord, to us. The chamber's translation systems flickered, not with interference, but with sudden clarity. The human's voice was rendered flawlessly across every linguistic channel, adapted in real time to each species' perception. For the first time, we were not hearing the Zir. We were hearing him. "These are not terms," the human said. His gaze moved, not erratic, but intentional, meeting the visual organs of species that processed sight, aligning with sensory nodes of those that did not. "This is a termination sequence." A wave of unease surged outward, because he was right. We had known it, but we had not named it. And in naming it, he changed it. The Zir warlord's patience thinned. "You will cease this behavior, or you will be removed." Removed, a word the Zir used sparingly, because it rarely required clarification. The human did not react. Instead, he returned his attention to the warlord and asked the question again. This time, there was no room for misinterpretation, no softness, no ambiguity. "Is that your final offer?" The repetition fractured something, not in the chamber, in the balance of it. The Zir warlord moved. It was not an attack, yet every instinct I possessed screamed that it could become one in less than a fraction of a cycle. His massive form leaned forward, closing distance without taking a step, his presence expanding like a gravitational field. "You persist," he observed. The human met his gaze. "Yes." There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation, only certainty. And in that certainty, something impossible began to take shape.
The Zir warlord studied him now, not as one studies prey, but as one evaluates an unknown variable. The Zir did not fear easily, they did not question, but they did calculate. And the human, he was no longer fitting within expected parameters. "You believe," the warlord said slowly, "that you have the authority to alter the outcome of this proceeding." It was not a question. The human answered anyway. "I believe," he said, "that outcomes are decided by those willing to challenge them." The chamber reacted, not outwardly. Most species lack the capacity for visible expression under such pressure, but internally, chemically, neurologically. Hope. It was irrational, dangerous, unprecedented, but it was there. The Zir warlord straightened, his full height casting a shadow that seemed to consume the central dais. "You are one individual, representing a minor species, standing in a chamber you do not control, facing an empire you cannot oppose." Each statement was fact, absolute, unarguable. "And yet," the human replied, "you're still answering me." That was the moment, the precise instant when understanding began to spread, not fully formed, not yet accepted, but undeniable. This was no longer a translation, this was a confrontation. The Zir warlord's form stilled completely. Every system in the chamber seemed to hold its breath, because we all sensed it. A threshold. Once crossed, there would be no return. "You have been given a function," the warlord said, his voice now stripped of all pretense. "Fulfill it, or be erased." The human's eyes did not waver. Instead, he returned his attention to the warlord and asked the question again. This time, there was no room for misinterpretation, no softness, no ambiguity. "Is that your final offer?"
We had studied humanity. That is what we told ourselves. Entire archives had been compiled, behavioral analyses, biological breakdowns, historical reconstructions of their conflicts. Their wars were documented in precise detail: crude projectile weapons, inefficient energy systems, strategies driven more by emotion than logic. They were inelegant, predictable in their unpredictability. A species that survived not through superiority, but through circumstance. That was our conclusion. That was our mistake. Because standing there, in that chamber, balanced on the edge of annihilation, I began to understand something we had all overlooked. We had studied how humans fought. We had never understood why they refused to stop. The silence stretched, heavy and unstable, as the human's final question lingered unanswered. The Zir warlord remained motionless, his towering form locked in calculation. For the first time, uncertainty had entered the equation, and the human, he did not wait. He turned, not away from the warlord, but outward, toward us, toward every delegate in the chamber, toward every species that had come here expecting to witness their own extinction formalized into law. When he spoke again, it was not in the trade language. It was not even in a single voice. It was many. The translation system surged to life, not as passive conduits, but as extensions of his intent. His words flowed simultaneously across hundreds of linguistic frameworks, each perfectly adapted, each carrying not just meaning, but nuance. He spoke to each of us, individually, flawlessly. To the Threxian hive clusters, he spoke in harmonic pulses that resonated through their shared consciousness. To the Valar, he used layered chemical inflections embedded within the audio spectrum. To my own kind, he spoke in precise tonal modulations that bypassed emotional distortion entirely. Impossible. No translation matrix functioned like this. No species processed language this completely. And yet, he did. "You have been told this is the end,"
the human said. The words echoed differently for each of us, but the meaning remained constant. You have been told resistance is no longer viable, that survival now depends on submission. A pause, not for effect, for absorption. I felt it settle into my cognition, forcing pathways open that I had already begun to close. You believe this, he continued, because you've seen what happens to those who don't comply. Images flickered in my memory, burning skies, collapsing biospheres, the silent aftermath of Zur conquest. Yes, I thought, we had seen, we had learned, we had adapted, we had chosen survival. The human's gaze moved across the chamber, locking briefly with each delegate as if he could see the exact moment doubt began to fracture. You think that makes you rational, he said. Something shifted in his tone. Not anger, not contempt, recognition. But you're wrong. The statement landed harder than any accusation, because it wasn't dismissive, it was certain. The warlord moved then, subtly, but enough to remind us all of his presence. This was still his chamber, his victory, his moment. But the human did not yield the focus. Instead, he continued, "Your data on my species is incomplete," he said. "You've analyzed our wars, our weapons, our casualty rates. You've measured our limitations." Another pause. And then, "But you never understood our pattern." I felt a flicker of resistance within myself, a reflexive dismissal. What pattern could possibly matter in the face of an empire like the Zur? The human answered before the thought could fully form. "When humans are outmatched, we do not surrender." A ripple moved through the chamber. Not disbelief, recognition. Because we had seen fragments of this in our studies, isolated incidents, statistical anomalies, events we had dismissed as outliers. When we are outnumbered, we do not retreat. The warlord's posture shifted again, this time more noticeably, a tightening, a recalibration, because now he was listening. When we are pushed to the edge of extinction, the human's voice lowered, not in volume, but in weight. We escalate. The word struck like a gravitational collapse. Escalate. Not endure, not survive. Escalate. Every system in my body reacted to it. It was not a strategy we recognized, not a logical progression. Escalation in the face of overwhelming force was self-destructive. Unless survival was no longer the objective. The human let the silence build again, allowing the implication to take shape on its own. And when he spoke next, it was no longer explanation. It was warming. "You have been told this ends with your surrender," he said, addressing us all. "That if you comply, some part of your species will persist." His gaze hardened. "It won't." The certainty in his voice was absolute. Extinction doesn't negotiate, it just takes longer when you cooperate. A shockwave of realization tore through the chamber, because we had known, deep within our most suppressed calculations, we had known. The Zur did not conquer, they consumed. Surrender was not survival, it was delay. The warlord stepped forward fully now, the air itself distorting around his mass. "You speak beyond your station," he said, his voice resonating with restrained violence. "You incite defiance where there should be acceptance." The human turned back to face him. "Yes," he said, simply, no hesitation, no apology. And then he did something no translator, no diplomat, no minor species representative had ever done in the presence of the Zur. He raised his voice, not in volume, in authority. "They deserve to understand the truth before they choose," he said. The chamber froze again, because that word, choose, it had not existed here before, not really. The warlord's gaze sharpened to a lethal focus. "There is no choice," he said. The human held his ground. "There always is." And then, impossibly, he turned away from the warlord again, back to us, back to the ones who had already begun to accept our end. "You've been fighting this war as separate species, separate fleets, separate strategies, separate losses." Each word was a blade cutting through the illusions we had built to justify our failures. "That's why you're losing." No one argued. No one could, because it was true. We had never truly been united, only aligned by necessity. "But humans," he continued, "we don't fight like that." Something changed in his posture then, not physically, conceptually, as if the space around him had shifted to accommodate something larger than his form. "We connect, we adapt, we learn from every defeat." His eyes moved across us again, and when we realize we're facing extinction, a pause, a breath, a moment where the entire galaxy seemed to narrow down to a single point of understanding, we stop playing by the rules that got us there. The implication hit like a system-wide failure, because if what he said was true, then everything we understood about war, about limits, about survival, was irrelevant. The warlord understood it too. I saw it in the way his stance adjusted, in the subtle recalibration of his presence. The human was no longer disrupting the negotiation. He was dismantling its foundation, rewriting its foundation, turning inevitability into uncertainty. And worst of all, the chamber was beginning to listen, not out of obligation, not out of protocol, but because for the first time since the war began, what he was saying felt possible. Hope. It spread quietly, dangerously, like a signal no system could suppress. And as it took hold, as species that had already accepted their end began to reconsider, the warlord realized what was happening. The human was not translating surrender, he was igniting resistance. And if he was not stopped, this would no longer be a controlled extinction. It would become something far worse, something the Zur had not prepared for. Because for the first time, the outcome was no longer certain. And in that uncertainty, the war truly began.
The warlord's patience ended. Not gradually, not with the measured restraint we had come to expect from a species that perfected annihilation into ritual. It ended all at once. The chamber responded before any of us could. Ancient protocols awakened. I felt them before I saw them. Deep systems buried beneath layers of diplomatic pretense surged to life. The walls shifted, subtle seams opening along their blackened surfaces. Energy signatures spiked across the spectrum, invisible to most, but painfully clear to those of us equipped to perceive them. Defense arrays, execution systems, weapons designed not for war, but for containment, for moments like this, moments when something inside the chamber became unacceptable. The air itself grew heavier, as if reality were bracing for violence, and at the center of it all, the human stood still. He had to feel it. Even without our sensory ranges, even without our augmentations, any being with survival instinct would have recognized what was about to happen. A single command. That was all it would take. The Zir warlord did not need to move, did not need to strike. He only needed to decide. "You have exceeded all permitted boundaries," the warlord said, his voice no longer resonant with performance, but stripped down to its most lethal form, pure intent. "Your function is terminated." The words echoed like a verdict. Around me, I felt the coalition delegates react, not outwardly, but internally,
Chemical spikes, neural surges, instinctive preparation for the aftermath. We had seen this before, not here, but elsewhere. A single being erased mid-sentence, no resistance, no trace. A correction. That is what the Zir called it. And now the human was about to be corrected. But he did not flinch, not even a fraction. Instead, he stepped forward. The motion was small, insignificant in distance, but in meaning, it was catastrophic. He crossed the invisible line that separated observer from participant, translator from speaker, subject from equal. Gasps, audible, chemical, electromagnetic, rippled through the chamber. Every instinct screamed that this was the moment, the end of the anomaly, the restoration of order. But the human kept moving, one step, then another, until he stood not behind the ambassador, but beside him. No armor, no shield, no weapon, only certainty. And when he spoke again, it was no longer as a translator, not even as an individual. It was something else entirely. "If these are your terms," he said, his voice steady, carrying through every layer of the chamber's systems, "then humanity rejects them." The universe broke. There is no other way to describe it. The statement was so far beyond acceptable parameters that for a moment reality itself seemed to fail in processing it. Reject. The word echoed, fractured, repeated across every translation channel. Humanity rejects them. Humanity rejects. Impossible. The chamber erupted. Delegates broke formation, some physically recoiling, others flooding the communication bands with emergency signals. Diplomatic protocols collapsed under the weight of the declaration. Systems attempted to categorize the statement, error after error cascading through their logic cores. Because this was not something that could happen. No species rejected Zir terms. They negotiated, they pleaded, they delayed, but they did not reject, not if they intended to survive. The warlord did not move, but everything about him changed. The stillness became absolute, total, the kind of stillness that precedes extinction. "You do not speak for your species," he said. Each word was precise, controlled, deadly. The human did not hesitate. "I do." The response landed harder than the declaration itself, because there was no hesitation, no qualification, no appeal to authority, just certainty. The warlord's presence expanded, pressing against the limits of the chamber itself. Energy readings surged higher, weapon systems aligning, locking, preparing. "You claim authority you do not possess," the warlord said. The human's gaze did not waver. "You assume limits you don't understand." A pause, a fracture. The warlord adjusted, recalculated. For the first time since his arrival, he did not immediately act. And that hesitation, that single microscopic delay, was all the human needed. "This isn't your war anymore," the human continued. The words cut through the chaos, forcing attention back to him. "This isn't about your terms, your conditions, your victory." He took another step forward, closing the distance, not aggressively, but undeniably. "This is about what happens next." The warlord's voice dropped, low enough that it seemed to bypass sound entirely. "There is no next," he said. "There is only compliance or extinction." The human nodded once, as if acknowledging a familiar argument. "We've heard that before." Something in his tone shifted then, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, carrying something ancient, something earned. And every time he continued, "we proved it wrong." A ripple of unease moved through the chamber, because there was something in his voice, something that did not align with a species on the brink of destruction. Confidence, not arrogance, not desperation, certainty. And then he said the word, "I'm declaring war." Everything stopped. Not slowed, not paused, stopped. The concept itself was incomprehensible. War. There was already a war. It had consumed systems, species, entire histories. What could he possibly mean? The warlord tilted his head, just slightly, a gesture so small, yet so profoundly alien to his usual absolute control that it sent a shock through my perception. "Clarify," he said. The human did. "This war is over," he said, gesturing, not physically, but conceptually, toward the coalition. "You've already won it." A pause, a shift, a redefinition. But this, his gaze locked onto the warlord, is a new one. The chamber struggled to process the distinction. A new war? Between whom? The answer came before the question fully formed. Humanity is now in conflict with the Zir Dominion. The words settled like gravity, heavy, unavoidable, final. Confusion surged through the delegates. Data streams lit up as species attempted to verify the claim, to locate Terran fleets, to identify any sign of imminent threat within range. There was nothing. No armadas, no formations, no evidence of imminent threat. From a purely strategic standpoint, the declaration was meaningless, suicidal. The warlord saw it too. "You are alone," he said. It was not an insult. It was a statement of fact. "You declare war with nothing." The human's expression did not change. "That's where you're wrong." A flicker, not in the chamber, in the warlord. A micro-adjustment, a recalculation, because the human was not correcting him emotionally. He was correcting him factually. "We've been here longer than you think," the human said. The words were quiet, but they carried something immense. "Watching," he continued, "learning." The chamber stilled again, a different kind of silence now. Not fear, not shock, something else. Realization. "You thought we were observers," the human said, a faint shift of his posture. "We were preparing." The implication hit like a system-wide failure. Preparation required time, access, information, presence, things the Zir did not allow without consequence. And yet, this human stood here, unharmed, unfrayed, declaring war. The warlord's gaze sharpened to a lethal point. "You overestimate your species," he said. The human shook his head once. "No," he replied. A pause, a breath, a moment where everything balanced on the edge of something irreversible. "You underestimate it."
The warlord laughed. It was not a sound I had ever recorded from a Zir before. Not because they lacked the capacity, but because they had never been given a reason. Until now. The sound was wrong, layered, discordant. It reverberated through the chamber in jagged frequencies, like metal fracturing under impossible stress. It was not amusement as we understood it. It was dismissal. Total. Absolute. "You declare war?" the warlord repeated, his voice still carrying the remnants of that alien laughter. "With no fleet, no territory, no demonstrated capability?" Each word cut with surgical precision. "You are insignificant." The statement should have ended it. By all known metrics, strategic, technological, historical, the warlord was correct. Humanity was not a dominant force. Their fleets, where they existed, were limited in scale. Their weapons systems, while innovative, lacked the raw, destructive capacity of the great empires. Their territory was compact, their expansion cautious. They were contained, manageable, irrelevant. That is what we believed. That is what the warlord believed. The human did not argue. He did not defend. He did not attempt to elevate his species through exaggerated claims or desperate projections of strength. Instead, he explained. "You're measuring the wrong things," he said. The chamber stilled again, drawn into the quiet gravity of his voice. "You're counting ships, weapons, territory." He paused, as if considering the simplicity of it. "That's not how we calculate war." The warlord's posture shifted slightly, his attention sharpening, not because he was threatened, but because he was curious. A dangerous miscalculation. "Then explain," the warlord said. A command, an invitation, a mistake. The human inclined his head just slightly. "Humanity never tried to dominate the galaxy," he said. A ripple of agreement passed through the delegates. Not much was true. Their expansion had been cautious, almost hesitant compared to the aggressive sprawl of other species. "But not because we couldn't," he continued. The ripple stopped, fractured, reversed. "Because we understood something you didn't." The warlord's gaze narrowed. "And what is that?" he asked. The human's answer came without hesitation. "Strength isn't what wins wars." A pause, not for effect, for realization. "Persistence does." The words settled into the chamber like a foreign element, incompatible with everything we knew about conflict at a galactic scale. Wars were decided by overwhelming force, by superior technology, by strategic dominance. Persistence was irrelevant, or so we had believed. "You measure victory by how quickly you can end a conflict. We measure it by whether we're still standing when it's over." A subtle shift moved through the delegates, because that was different. Not stronger, not faster, but enduring. The warlord adjusted his stance again, this time more noticeably. The absolute certainty that had defined his presence since his arrival began to fracture, not visibly, not completely, but enough. "You imply resilience," he said. "All species possess it to varying degrees." The human shook his head. "No," he said. "We imply something else." A pause, a breath, a recalibration of the entire chamber's attention. "We don't stop." The simplicity of it was almost meaningless until he continued. "You wipe out our fleets, we rebuild them." Images flickered through my mind, drawn from fragmented human records, wars that should have ended in total defeat, continuing long past logical conclusion. "You destroy our infrastructure, we adapt." I remembered case studies, human colonies surviving in environments that should have killed them within days. "You outmatch us, outnumber us, outgun us." His gaze locked onto the warlord. "We change the rules." The words hit differently this time, because now they were not theoretical. They were a promise. The warlord did not laugh again. He listened, and that, more than anything, unsettled me. "Persistence without capability is irrelevant. You will simply delay your extinction." The human nodded. "Yes," he said. The agreement was immediate, unforced, and completely disarming. "If we fought you the way everyone else does." A shift, a pivot, a revelation. "But we don't." The chamber leaned into that moment, not physically, but conceptually. Every system, every mind, every instinct focused on the human as he spoke the next words. "We've been studying you." The statement should have been insignificant. All species studied each other. It was the foundation of diplomacy, of war, of survival. But the way he said it
it felt different. Not just you, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. All of you. A cold realization began to form. You catalog strengths, we catalog weaknesses. The implication struck like a precision strike. You analyze battles, we analyze patterns. I felt it then, a slow, creeping understanding that rewrote everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. You prepare for war when it begins. A pause, a fracture, a moment where all the systems balanced on the edge of revelation. We've been preparing since we arrived. Silence, deep, absolute. Because that was not how any species operated. Preparation required intent. Intent required expectation. Expectation of what? The answer came, unspoken, but undeniable. This. The human took a step, not forward, not back, but into the center of attention itself. We don't expand aggressively, he said. Fragments of data aligned in my mind, human vessels in peripheral systems dismissed as exploratory missions, diplomatic envoys embedded in conflicts they had no direct stake in. We build relationships, quietly. I remembered trade agreements, cultural exchanges, minor cooperative ventures that seemed insignificant at the time. Insignificant, until now. And when a line gets crossed, his voice lowered, not in volume, in weight. We act. The chamber reacted, not outwardly, but internally. Systems strained under the pressure of a realization too large to process cleanly. The Zir had crossed that line, not once, not twice, repeatedly, systematically, and humanity had been watching. The warlord's voice cut through the silence. You claim preparation, yet you present no evidence. A challenge, a demand. The human met it without hesitation. We didn't think we'd need to. The answer was quiet, but absolute. And now, the warlord pressed, the human's gaze did not waver. Now you've made it necessary. A pause stretched between them, thin, fragile, loaded with consequences neither side had fully revealed. What exactly have you prepared? The question carried more weight than any before it, because this time he needed an answer. The human smiled. It was a small expression, subtle, almost invisible to species that did not study human microsignals. But I saw it, and it unsettled me more than anything else that had happened. Enough, he said. The word echoed, not as a boast, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Enough to know how this ends. The warlord stilled completely. And how does it end? The human held his gaze, not as a subordinate, not as an equal, but as something the galaxy had never accounted for. It ends, he said, with you realizing you made a mistake. A pause, a fracture, a moment where the entire chamber balanced on the edge of revelation. And by the time you understand it, the human finished, it'll already be too late. The silence that followed was different from any before, heavier, deeper, because now we understood. Humanity had not been absent, they had not been passive, they had not been irrelevant, they had been waiting, watching, learning, preparing. And as I stood there in that chamber where empires ended with a word, I felt something I had not experienced since the war began. Not fear of the Zir, but something else, something far more uncertain. Because if the human was telling the truth, then this war had never been as one-sided as we believed. And somewhere beyond the limits of our perception, humanity was already moving.
The warlord was about to speak. I saw it in the subtle expansion of his thoracic plating, in the minute recalibration of his stance, the prelude to command. Whatever response he had calculated, whatever correction he intended to impose upon the human's impossible defiance, it never came, because the chamber flickered. At first, it was so slight that I questioned my own perception, a momentary distortion in the ambient lighting, a fractional delay in the environmental harmonics, the kind of anomaly that complex systems occasionally produced under strain. Then it happened again, longer, more noticeable. The lights dimmed, not entirely, but unevenly, as if different sections of the chamber were falling out of synchronization with each other. The gravity field stuttered, just enough to send a ripple of instability through those species dependent on precise calibration. A murmur spread, confusion, alertness. The warlord stilled, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition. Something was wrong. "Report," he commanded. His voice cut through the chamber, sharp and immediate, directed not at us, but at the systems themselves. The Zer did not rely on intermediaries. Their command structures were integrated, direct, absolute. There should have been an instant response. There wasn't. A delay, brief, but impossible. The warlord's presence shifted, pressure building within the space as his attention turned inward, interfacing with networks we could not perceive. And then, the chamber went dark. Not completely. Emergency systems engaged instantly, casting the room in low-spectrum illumination. The environmental fields stabilized, but only barely, their precision degraded. This was no minor malfunction. This was failure. Across every delegation, panic began to rise, not uncontrolled, but undeniable. Systems that had functioned flawlessly for centuries did not simply stop. Not here, not under Zer control. "What is this?" one of the coalition delegates transmitted, their signal bleeding through multiple frequencies. No one answered, because no one knew. The warlord's voice returned, louder now, edged with something I had never detected before. Not fear, but strain. "Restore primary systems," he ordered. Silence. No response. No acknowledgement. Nothing. And then, the human spoke. Calm, steady, untouched by the rising chaos. "This is the part where you realize," he said, "that we weren't exaggerating." Every sensor I possessed locked onto him, because he was not reacting, he was observing, as if this, all of this, was expected. The warlord turned toward him slowly, every movement precise, controlled. "You've done this," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a conclusion. The human inclined his head slightly. Yes. The simplicity of the admission sent a shock through the chamber, because this was not possible. The Zer controlled their infrastructure with absolute redundancy. Their systems were layered, compartmentalized, shielded against intrusion at levels no known species had ever breached. To disrupt even a single node required overwhelming force or impossible access. And yet, everything was failing. "Impossible," the warlord said. The word carried less certainty than before. The human didn't argue. He didn't need to. Instead, he gestured, not physically, but through the systems themselves. And suddenly, the chamber filled with data. Fragments of transmissions, collapsing signal pathways, navigation grids spiraling into incoherence, strategic command nodes blinking out one by one across sectors too vast to comprehend. It wasn't localized, it wasn't contained, It was everywhere. Across the galaxy, the Zir dominion was unraveling. "This isn't an attack," the human said. His voice cut cleanly through the chaos, anchoring attention despite everything else collapsing around us. "It's a demonstration." The word landed heavily, because attacks could be resisted. Demonstrations were meant to be understood. The warlord's internal systems surged again, attempting to reconnect, to reassert control over networks that had always obeyed without question. "They are isolated failures," he said, though the statement lacked conviction. "Localized disruptions." The human shook his head. "No," he said, "they're not." Another cascade of data flooded the chamber, clearer now, more precise. Not raw failure, but patterned collapse. Targeted, intentional. Every disrupted node revealed something deeper, a map, a structure, a design that no external observer should have been able to access. "We mapped your infrastructure. All of it." The warlord stilled. Completely. Because that was impossible. "You don't even know how your own redundancies interact," the human said. Not mocking, not arrogant, just factual. "We do." The chamber processed that statement in fragments, struggling to reconcile it with everything we understood about the Zir. "They're decentralized," one delegate whispered across a private channel, "compartmentalized beyond standard penetration models." "They were," the human corrected gently. A pause. A fracture. Before we started paying attention. The warlord's presence intensified, pressure building again, but this time it lacked the absolute control it had once carried. "You're claiming total system infiltration," he said. The human nodded. "No," he replied. A beat. "We're demonstrating partial access." The distinction was subtle, but devastating. Because if this widespread collapse was only partial, then the full extent was unimaginable. Across the chamber, delegates began accessing their own external networks, attempting to verify what we were seeing. Every report came back the same. Zir systems were failing. Not catastrophically, not chaotically, but precisely. Like something was testing them, probing, measuring, learning in real time. "This is a fraction," the human said, confirming what we were all beginning to fear. A small one. The warlord did not respond immediately. For the first time since his arrival, he had no immediate answer. Because this was no longer theoretical, no longer a possibility. It was happening, now in real time. "You expect me to believe," the warlord said slowly, "that your species achieved this without detection." The human met his gaze. "Yes." A pause. "And you didn't notice." The words hit harder than any weapon, because they implied something far worse than vulnerability. They implied blindness. "You watched us," the warlord said. The human nodded. "For a long time." "And we allowed it?" A flicker of something passed through the human's expression. Not amusement, not quite, not exactly. Another cascade of data flooded the chamber, historical records now, human vessels entering peripheral systems under diplomatic clearance, trade networks establishing minor footholds, data exchanges embedded within seemingly harmless interactions. Every point of contact, every moment of access, every opportunity taken. "You never saw us as a threat," the human said. A simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything that was happening.
so you never looked closely. The warlord's silence stretched, longer than any before, because now he was not calculating victory. He was reassessing reality. The human took a slow breath, his posture unchanged, his presence steady amid the unraveling systems. "This is your first lesson," he said, "not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact." The chamber dimmed again, systems struggling, stabilizing, failing in controlled sequences that mirrored the data still streaming across every surface. "You're not in control anymore." The words settled into the space between them.
The collapse slowed. Not because it was stopped, because it was controlled. I began to see the pattern. At first, it had appeared as chaos, systems failing, networks fragmenting, command structures dissolving into silence. But now, as my sensory arrays recalibrated, I understood the truth. This was not destruction, it was restraint. Each failure halted just short of irreversibility. Each disruption revealed vulnerability without fully exploiting it. Strategic nodes went dark, but not permanently. Communications fractured, but were not erased. This was not war. Not yet. It was a message. And at the center of it, the human. He had not moved. Not since the systems began to fail. Not since the warlord's certainty had first begun to fracture. He simply stood there, watching, waiting, as if everything unfolding around us was proceeding exactly as intended. The warlord adjusted his stance again, more visibly this time. The perfect stillness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something far more unstable: deliberation. His internal systems were still attempting to compensate, to regain control over an infrastructure that had never betrayed him before. But the results were the same: partial restoration, followed by precise disruption, again and again and again. A loop, a demonstration. "You're proving a point," the warlord said at last. The statement carried no accusation, only recognition. The human inclined his head slightly. Yes. The simplicity of the answer settled heavily into the chamber. The warlord's gaze sharpened, locking onto the human with renewed intensity. "And what point," he asked, "is that?" The human did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence expand, allowed the failing systems, the fractured data streams, the subtle instability in every environmental field to speak for him. Then, "You can't win this," he said. The words were quiet, but absolute. A ripple passed through the coalition delegates: shock, disbelief, something dangerously close to awe. Because no one had ever said that to the Zir, not and survived long enough for it to matter. The warlord did not react with immediate hostility. That, more than anything, confirmed the shift. "You believe disruption equates to victory. It does not." The human nodded. "I agree." The response was immediate, uncomplicated, disarming. "This isn't victory." A pause, a recalibration. "This is an introduction." The implication struck deeper than any threat, because introductions implied escalation. The warlord processed that. I could see it in the subtle tightening of his form, in the minute adjustments of his stance as he reevaluated the human, not as an anomaly, but as an opponent. "You escalate," the warlord said. Not a question, a realization. The human met his gaze. "Yes." Silence followed, heavy, loaded, because now they understood each other. Not completely, but enough. The warlord's voice lowered, carrying a new weight,
one shaped not by dominance, but by calculation. "And what is your objective?" he asked. The human's answer came without hesitation. "To end this." A ripple of confusion spread through the chamber. End this? The war was already ending, in Zir victory, in coalition surrender. But the human was not referring to that. "You misunderstand. This conflict has already been decided." The human shook his head. "No," he said, "it hasn't." A pause, a fracture. "Not the way you think." The chamber leaned into that moment, every system, every mind focused on the space between them, because something fundamental was about to change. The human took a slow breath, and then he offered something no one expected. "You have a choice." The word echoed through every translation channel. Choice. It did not belong here, not in this chamber, not in this war. The warlord's posture shifted again, sharper now, more focused. "Explain," he said. The human did. "Withdraw your forces. Cease all hostile operations. Return to your controlled territories." Each condition landed with impossible weight. Recognize the sovereignty of coalition species. A flicker of reaction moved through the delegates. Hope. Unstable. Dangerous. Accept coexistence. The final condition settled into the chamber like a gravitational anomaly. Unthinkable. For the Zir, unacceptable. The warlord was silent for a long time, longer than any pause he had allowed before, because this was new, not a demand for surrender, not a negotiation of terms, an offer, structured, balanced, final. "And if we refuse?" the warlord asked at last. The human did not raise his voice, did not shift his stance, did not break eye contact. "Then this continues," he said. A pause, a breath, a moment where the entire galaxy seemed to hold itself still. But not like before. The words carried something deeper now, not threat, certainty. "You've fought species that try to survive. You haven't fought one that refuses to lose." The chamber absorbed that in silence, because now we understood the difference. The warlord's internal systems surged again, calculations cascading through possibilities that no longer aligned with certainty. To withdraw would preserve the dominion, but fracture its image of invincibility. To continue would risk something far worse, not immediate defeat, but prolonged conflict, escalation, adaptation, an enemy that did not stop, an enemy that had already proven it could reach into the core of Zir control and rewrite it. Pride warred with logic, dominance with survival. For the first time in recorded history, the Zir were not dictating terms, they were receiving them. The human said nothing more. He did not push, did not elaborate, did not threaten. He simply waited, silent, unmoving, certain, and in that silence, something changed. Not in the chamber, not in the systems, in the warlord. I saw it. A smallest hesitation, the slightest delay, the fracture in absolute certainty. Fear. Not as we experience it, not as a loss of control, but as recognition. Recognition that the outcome was no longer guaranteed. Recognition that continuation carried risk, real risk. For the first time, the Zir were facing something they could not immediately dominate. The silence stretched, longer, heavier, until it became almost unbearable, because we all understood whatever happened next would define the future of the galaxy. And the human, he did not move, he did not speak, he did not need to. because for the first time, the decision was not his, it was the warlord's, and that, more than anything, terrified him.
The warlord did not move. For a long time, I believed he never would. The chamber existed in a state beyond silence, beyond tension. It was as if time itself had narrowed, compressing every possible future into a single, fragile moment balanced on the edge of decision. No systems failed now. No data cascaded. The demonstration had ended. Everything held, waiting. The warlord stood at the center of it all, his towering form perfectly still, yet no longer absolute. The certainty that once defined him had been replaced by something far more complex. Calculation. Not of victory, of consequence. I watched him, studied every micro-adjustment, every fractional shift in posture that betrayed the internal war unfolding within him. To continue would mean escalation, not the kind he understood, not overwhelming force, not swift annihilation, something slower, relentless, adaptive, an enemy that did not break, an enemy that had already reached into the core of his empire and shown him with quiet precision exactly how vulnerable it was. To withdraw would preserve everything, his fleets, his systems, his dominion. But it would cost him something the Zir had never lost before: perception, invincibility, control. The chamber waited, every species, every system, every breath, waiting for a decision that would define not just the end of this conflict, but the nature of all conflicts to come. The human did not move, he did not speak, he did not exist in the way he had before. He simply stood there, as if the outcome had already been decided, and he was merely allowing the warlord time to realize it. And then it happened. The smallest movement, so subtle that under any other circumstance it would have gone unnoticed. The warlord inclined his head. Not in submission, not in defeat, in acknowledgement. A gesture so alien, so unprecedented, that it sent a shockwave through my entire cognitive framework. And then he spoke. One word. Withdraw. It did not echo. It did not need to. The command propagated instantly through whatever systems still obeyed him, carried not by force, but by authority that remained, fractured but intact. Across the chamber, the effect was immediate, a release, not visible, not audible, but undeniable. The coalition delegates exhaled as one. Some collapsed inward, their structures unable to maintain composure after cycles of sustained tension. Others remained still, as if movement itself might somehow undo what had just occurred. We were alive. We were still here. The war that should have ended us, was over. Or rather, it had never truly begun. The warlord did not look away from the human, not immediately. For a brief moment they remained locked in silent recognition, not equals, not allies, but something far more dangerous, opponents who understood each other. And then, slowly, the warlord turned. Without another word, without ceremony or acknowledgement of the chamber, he disengaged from the central dais. His form receded, carried away by systems that had begun cautiously to restore themselves. The Zir dominion was retreating, not defeated, not destroyed, but deterred. The realization settled heavily into the chamber. This was not victory as we had defined it, no fleets destroyed, no worlds reclaimed, no enemy annihilated. And yet we had survived, because something had changed, fundamentally, irreversibly. Deterrence, not through strength,
but through demonstration, through the quiet, undeniable proof that continuation would cost more than even the Zir were willing to pay. I turned my attention back to the human, and for a moment I almost failed to recognize him. He had stepped back, returned to his original position behind the Terran ambassador, his posture relaxed, neutral, unremarkable, invisible. A translator, nothing more, nothing less. As if everything that just happened, every word, every shift, every impossible act had not originated from him. But we knew. Every species in that chamber knew. We had seen what he truly was, what his species truly was, and that knowledge could not be undone. Humans did not need fleets at the edge of every system. They did not need overwhelming force. They did not need dominance. They only needed one thing: to prove that they could. And in doing so, they had ended a war before it ever truly began.
We did not speak of it at first. Not openly. Not officially. In the immediate cycles following the withdrawal of desired dominion, there was only silence, an uneasy recalibration of galactic order. Systems that had once prepared for extinction now struggled to define what survival meant in its absence. There were no celebrations, only processing. Because what had occurred in the chamber on Kethra Prime did not fit into any existing framework of understanding. Wars ended, empires fell, treaties were rewritten, but none of those categories applied here. This was something else. And so, at first, it was recorded quietly, filed under diplomatic irregularities, containment anomalies, unverified psychological escalation events. The human remained unnamed in most records. Officially, he did not exist as a variable of significance. Unclassified, unacknowledged, irrelevant. And yet, across every major system of governance, across every coalition and independent polity that had witnessed fragments of the transmission, one truth began to spread. Not as propaganda, not as rumor, but as warning. Humans were no longer studied as a minor emerging species. They were no longer categorized under developing interstellar entities. They were reassessed completely. The shift was not immediate, but it was absolute. Diplomatic protocols changed within cycles. Engagement strategies were rewritten. Risk models recalibrated themselves without authorization as new data forced unavoidable conclusions. Humanity was no longer unpredictable. It was now intentionally opaque, and that was worse. Because unpredictability implies randomness, opacity implies design, and design implies intent. That realization alone altered the structure of interstellar diplomacy more than any war ever could. Within cycles, alliances began to form, not against humanity, not in defiance, but around them. Species that had once considered human presence peripheral now sought proximity, not for protection, not for advantage, but for understanding. Because everyone had seen the same moment, the same silence, the same transformation. A translator stepping forward and redefining the boundaries of war itself. But when inquiries were made, when records were requested, when testimonies were demanded, the answers never fully arrived. The Terran envoy remained unchanged, polite, controlled, carefully diplomatic, and entirely uninformative. As for the translator, his designation remained classified at the highest possible levels. No species claimed full knowledge of him. No record confirmed his authority. No archive agreed on his identity. And yet every archive agreed on one thing: he had changed everything. Entire civilizations traced their continued existence back to that single chamber,
to that single conversation, to that single moment where a human did something no one had ever permitted before. He spoke, not as a translator, not as an intermediary, but as a decision-maker. And in doing so, he had forced the galaxy to recognize something it had never been prepared to accept: that humans did not operate within expected roles. They did not remain within assigned boundaries. They did not behave according to observed patterns when those patterns threatened their survival. They redefined the system itself. Over time, a phrase emerged, not from human sources, but from those who had witnessed them, those who had survived them. It began quietly, circulating through encrypted diplomatic channels, then spreading into open discourse where it could no longer be contained. A warning, a heuristic, a rule of survival. When a human is silent, you are safe. The silence meant observation, assessment, containment. But when a human spoke, everything changed. Because speaking meant decision, and decision meant action, and action, in human terms, had already been proven to reshape empires. The second half of the phrase was never spoken lightly, because it carried implication beyond comfort. When a human begins to speak, it may already be too late. Too late for negotiation, too late for correction, too late for prevention. Because by the time a human had moved from silence into speech, the decision had already been made. And the galaxy had learned, in the most expensive way possible, that human decisions were not reactions, they were outcomes. I, who witnessed the chamber of Kethra Prime, record this not as history, but as calibration, a correction to all future models of human behavior. They are not unstable, they are not primitive, they are not evolving toward galactic parity. They are already there. They simply choose when to reveal it. And in the cycles since that moment, I have observed countless attempts to categorize them again, to reduce them to a variable, to predict their boundaries, to re-establish certainty. All have failed, because the truth we learned in that chamber cannot be unlearned. We did not encounter a new power. We encountered one that had already been waiting for us to notice it. And by the time we did, it had already spoken, and nothing in the galaxy was ever the same again.